I'm going to offer a few thoughts on where we are in social witness, in the denominations that many of us came from, in how we got where we are, and then some questions for where we go from here. I am a member of the Presbyterian Church USA, so most of what I say is based on experience in the PCUSA. I know there are some differences, but I think the broad trends are common across the traditions that we come from. First, I think we need to look back and see what is our heritage. And I think that there are some things that have particularly distinguished Presbyterians, but they're not exclusive. They're more a matter of emphasis. And some of these are shared to a greater or lesser extent with the other traditions. Presbyterians are a people with a high level of involvement in the political life of the nation and have had that involvement since the early days. You think of John Witherspoon, the one member of the clergy who signed the Declaration of Independence. Presbyterians preached sermons on political issues from the time of the Revolution. Through debates about slavery, there were political debates in presbyteries. And it was not just the clergy who were involved in discussing political issues. In fact, in many ways, it was lay people who took the lead. Presbyterians can count a disproportionate number of members of Congress. Even today, roughly 10% of the members of Congress identify themselves as Presbyterians. Now, I know they're not all PCUSA, but still, barely 2% of the population is Presbyterian, so there's a disproportionate representation. I think that the same thing is true of Anglicans/Episcopalians as well, that they've had a disproportionate involvement in public and political life. And this is not by chance. I think it does flow out of our teaching, and again, it's not an exclusively Presbyterian teaching. We do strongly emphasize the dignity of all callings, that those who are called to service in political office have a calling that is from God, and it is an important calling. That the mission of the church is more than just evangelism, that it is also called to glorify God in the way that we arrange our lives together in this world. We believe in God's common grace, and that government is one of the instruments of God's common grace to bless humankind. Presbyterians historically, going back to Calvin, do see positive functions of civil government, that it is a means of social righteousness, to borrow a phrase that goes back quite a bit. We believe that the law serves not only to show us our own sin and our need of salvation in Christ, but it also serves useful purposes in restraining evil during this time, in teaching us the good, and in showing us the character of God. Now, at the same time that we have this positive view of government, we also are conscious of the limitations of government. And again, other traditions also have some of these features. We do have a strong sense of human sinfulness and the resultant caution about the concentration of power. We have a sense that you need to limit power, distribute it more broadly. Certainly Presbyterians from the early days have been a people who are ready to challenge injustice and to resist tyranny. Calvin and early Calvinists formulated the theory that lower magistrates were entitled to stand up and resist the king or higher magistrates if they felt that the king was overstepping his proper authority. So we have this tradition. There are some other elements too. Presbyterians historically have emphasized education, and that's had tremendous influence not only here through Presbyterian colleges that have formed in important members of U.S. society, but overseas. The American University of Beirut in Lebanon was a tremendously important institution in the development of Arab nationalism in the early 20th century. Presbyterian schools in Korea were also of great importance in shaping Korean national identity at a time when that identity was being suppressed by the Japanese. So we have these traditions of social involvement. One can also argue, and there are Presbyterians who argue, that it's not merely the content of our teaching, but also the process by which we arrive at it that contributes to democratic society. That the Presbyterian form of government, with decisions reached in council by ministers and elders meeting together, seeking the Word of God in public debates, certainly influenced the way that our society has developed its democracies, with all the strengths and weaknesses that come with that. We do have a kind of separation of powers in the Presbyterian Church. Even the question of who is the highest official in the Presbyterian Church. Is it the stated clerk? Or is it the moderator? Or is it the chair of our General Assembly Council? Actually, the powers are divided, and there is no one person who speaks for the Presbyterian Church. And also in matters relating to conscience, the Presbyterian tradition going way back has a sense that there is freedom of conscience, but there are limits to that. That freedom of conscience does not mean license to believe or do anything that one wishes. So all of these kinds of things, I believe, have been a gift that Presbyterians, among others, and Lutherans and Anglicans and others have also made their contributions, but it's a gift that we have given to society. The irony is that for the first couple of centuries, despite all of this history and tradition of political activism, we did not have an institutionalized social witness. The involvement was ministers, elders, members of the church engaging political issues, but we did not have a big bureaucracy that was making social witness for us. However, there was a revolution around the mid-20th century that changed all of that. And we did begin to institutionalize social witness. We had church and society councils under various names that produced academic studies of various political issues, often drawing on leading experts in their field, seminary ethics professors, and so forth. And they produced statements that were adopted in the name of the church. General assemblies passed resolutions on all kinds of issues. And this continues to this day. The most recent assembly this July had 5 different committees that were dealing with issues of social witness. Those committees acted on 65 items of business, ranging from immigration to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to the definition of marriage under civil law, farm policy, developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, prison conditions, just any number of issues we have been willing to engage. We have the structures replicated at lower levels. Presbyteries have peace and justice committees. Local congregations have adult study classes that principally deal with political issues. We also, having large endowments in our foundation and also in our pension plan, have attempted to exercise some influence through political resolutions introduced and attempts to sway corporations to alter their policies in directions that we believe would be more just. The apogee of this whole model of social witness, I think, is the Confession of 1967, which you already heard referred to. That confession put social witness into our standards of doctrine. It started with Christology, but the conclusion of the confession is social witness. And it argues that just as Christ came to reconcile the world to God, so we are called to be agents of reconciliation. And it names particularly the issues of racial justice, poverty, and international peace as ones in which the church is called to take positions. And that was a very great inspiration to many people in the church. and led to an intensified involvement in these issues. At the time, the social witness then in the 1950s and 1960s was moderately left of center. So there was some gap between the membership and the stated positions of the church and its leadership, but the gap was not that wide. Presbyterians on the whole have leaned Republican. As long as there have been surveys, generally they vote about 60% Republican. But remember, back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of liberal Republicans. So the gap wasn't so wide at that point. But what you saw in the later 60s, moving into the 70s, in the PCUSA and in other denominations, was a process of radicalization. And there was kind of a template that began to be applied to issues. And I think the template was that when we were dealing with actions by those who were perceived to be apart from or opposed to our kind of people being for the most part married middle-class white Americans, that the imperative was peacemaking, that we had to find ways to bridge the gap, to own up to our own faults and to try to make amends to the people with whom we had differences. So peacemaking was the imperative there. On the other hand, when we were dealing with sins committed by people like us, the imperative was justice. And the approach very much was to identify oppressed groups of people and then to distinguish who was the perpetrator. And generally the perpetrator of the oppression was some group of people or institutions that we, the church, were perceived to be aligned with, whether it be the United States or middle-class Americans or whatever. And then what we did was we would find professed representatives of the oppressed group. This goes back to the identification of Marxist movements as being the sole legitimate representative of such and such a people. Likewise, radical feminist voices became the representatives of women. And more recently, the movement for gay and lesbian liberation, the leaders of that movement became the representatives for gay and lesbian people. And frequently these claims, as almost was always the case, the professed spokespeople did not always speak for the entire group, but we prefer to identify the oppressed spokespeople, to make the church take their side, to listen to them and have them tell us what needed to be done to right the situation. The world sets the agenda for the church was the slogan. And then to do what was necessary within the church to try to set things right, to change our language, to edit our theology if necessary, to eliminate teachings that were offensive to oppressed groups of people, and to install structures to guarantee representation and voice to the oppressed groups. Now again, this was not just Presbyterians, there were many others as well. I should add that through this process of radicalization, I believe that our decision-making processes were corrupted. And not that they were ever functioned perfectly, but folks who have been around longer than I tell me that the quality of debate at our General Assemblies has gone down over the decades. That we now function through 2-minute speeches that are mostly emotional appeals with personal stories. There's not a lot of biblical exegesis. There's not a lot of careful reasoning. There's not a lot of weighing of evidence from various sides. It is a decision-making process that has become very politicized and polarized. And again, one can draw possible analogies to the national situation as well. In the last 25 years, however, we've seen this model of social witness collapse. The copious resolutions that we produce, those long academic papers, which we still print, very few people read them, even within the denomination. They get even less attention on Capitol Hill and political bodies. The gap between the members and the official positions and the leadership of the church is much wider as the leadership became radicalized. And members of Congress, if nothing else, can count votes. And they know that the Presbyterians in their districts don't feel the way that is being expressed by the denominational leaders. We also see, and the other thing that I would observe too, is that as the 90s wore on, almost all of the energy was poured into the sexuality debates. The only other issue that aroused a great amount of passion has been the Middle East. And that's far less. The circle of activists who are pushing pro-Palestinian positions, which tends to be the leaning of the PCUSA leadership, as the ELCA and the Episcopal churches as well. Those circles are fairly small, and it was quite surprising that the left, which had stood for social justice as they perceived it in a very broad way in earlier decades, where the concern was especially for the poor, now overwhelmingly, when they talk about justice, it's about justice for gay and lesbian people. Now, I'm going to leave aside that debate, but that's a fairly small group of people in society, and they're not self-evidently the most oppressed people in our society. So we have this model collapse. It's also collapsing for lack of money. In the last couple of decades, local churches have more and more kept their money to themselves. When they do give to the national level of the denominations, it's designated giving for particular projects. And the projects that they favor are evangelism, new church development, ministries to the poor domestically and overseas, educational institutions, hospitals, and so forth. They don't give money for political advocacy. And so the offices that engage in that political advocacy increasingly are starved for money. So even if you believed that the generally left-leaning positions being advocated were in fact a faithful witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's not an effective witness at this point. So what do? Many of us have left these mainline denominations. Some of us, like myself, are still within them. Is there another model? Well, I'm very conscious as a member of the PCUSA that the PCUSA is not the only Presbyterian denomination out there, that there are other approaches to Presbyterian social witness. There was a different approach before the mid-20th century. I have very much enjoyed getting to talk with Roy Taylor and Ed McCallum here at this meeting, and the PCA and the EPC have had several decades to develop their approach, which is quite distinct. And it's often an approach that I think is misunderstood by people coming out of a PCUSA tradition. In that approach, it seems to me that the most basic social witness of the church is not resolutions on one or another issues, but it's the proclamation of the gospel itself. The gospel challenges the idolatries of this world. It calls us to build Christian communities that offer an alternative to the kingdoms of this world. As well, the PCA and EPC and other Presbyterian bodies do address social needs through their own programs to deal with issues of poverty and disability and disaster and so forth. They don't generally prescribe what government would do, but they do try to do their part to meet the needs that we see out there in society. And as Bob Bene indicated, another important element is the Christian formation of lay leaders who themselves may have callings in public life and will go out there with their Christian faith as guidance for their involvement. And certainly my impression is that the PCA in particular has nurtured a number of people who have achieved some prominence in public life. And so they carry on in their own way that Presbyterian tradition. In general, these other Presbyterian bodies have been reluctant to take positions on particular political issues. The PCA, it seems to be more so than the EPC. That's my impression. The EPC has adopted statements on a few issues that are seen as involving basic biblical teachings. It's adopted statements on human life, addressing abortion and euthanasia, on marriage. Most recently, the 2012 Assembly of the EPC adopted a resolution opposing the Health and Human Services mandate for the coverage of contraceptives as problematic through the violation of conscience. Now, these statements, as I've read them, are mostly directed to members of the church. They're mostly pastoral counsel for church members as they're wrestling with these issues that come at us from society. But clearly there are public policy implications in them. I should add that my impression is, and I sense that impression has some validity, that the reluctance of the PCA and EPC to speak directly to political issues has some roots in a reaction to the perceived excesses of the PCUSA. The 65 resolutions at one General Assembly, I mean, from your perspective, must seem just horrific even to imagine that. So, but what I wonder, and I think the challenge for us is there a middle way? Is there some way that we can address issues that are coming at us from society that challenge us on basic biblical teachings, where we do have clear biblical teaching, but not do so in a way so that we become so promiscuous that we feel that we have to take a position on every public issue that is out there. And so I think that's the unanswered question that we face. I think there are dangers on both sides. There's the danger of seeming by our silence to imply that that the gospel has nothing to say to some of these issues that we're wrestling with in our society. But on the other hand, there is the danger that Bob Bennett mentioned of making it appear that the church has become an accomplice to one or another political faction. And that also would gravely damage our witness. So I leave you with that question.